The 9,364th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Threats to International Peace and Security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Mr. Max Blumenthal, journalist, founder, and editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone. Mr. Che Bauz, scholar specializing in small arms and munitions. And Mr. Sergei Radchenko, Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Since the last briefing to the Security Council on this topic in May this year, the provision of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine has continued in the context of full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Information on transfers of weapon systems and ammunition flows from governments are available through open sources. These transfers have included heavy conventional weapons, including battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircrafts, helicopters, large-caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions, small arms, and light weapons and their ammunition. There are reports that the supply of arms and ammunition has accelerated and expanded ahead of the reported counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces. There are also reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons, such as uncrewed combat aerial vehicles and ammunition, to the Russian armed forces for use in Ukraine. Moreover, media outlets have reported on the transfer of major conventional arms, including artillery rocket systems, to other armed groups involved in the war in Ukraine. The supply of weapons into any armed conflict situations raises significant concerns about the potential escalation of violence and the risks of diversion. Measures to address the risk of diversion to unauthorized end users and for unauthorized users are essential for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such measures include pre-transfer diversion risk assessments, end-user certificates, and non-retransfer clauses, effective legal and enforcement measures, and post-shipment verifications. To prevent the diversion of weapons, supply chain transparency and cooperation and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting states is required, as well as concrete measures such as marking and tracing, effective accounting and record-keeping practices, physical safeguarding of arms and ammunition, customs and border control measures, and diversion monitoring and analysis. As I mentioned many times before, transparency in armament is a crucial confidence-building measure, which can serve to reduce tensions and ambiguities between member states. The UN Register of Conventional Arms is a key instrument in this regard. Moreover, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and its International Tracing Instrument are some of the arms control instruments that have been established by states to prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade. Taking this opportunity, I welcome the recent conclusion of work by Open-Ended Working Group on Conventional Ammunition and commend the elaboration of a new global framework for through-life conventional ammunition management. The framework is a much-needed instrument to more effectively counter the diversion of conventional ammunition of all types, which continue to fuel instability, insecurity, and conflict across the world. I reiterate my call to states to join relevant treaties and agreements and to fully implement their legal obligations and political commitments under conventional arms control instruments to which they are party, to minimize the risk of diversion of arms and ammunition. The establishment of the Unified Weapons Register by the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs and Police, designed to digitize registration, accounting, and control activities associated with civilian firearms circulation, is a timely initiative to minimize diversion risks. Mr. President, the impact of the intensifying war in Ukraine on civilians continue to be an area of serious concern. From 24th of February 2022 to 18th of June 2023, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 24,862 civilian casualties in Ukraine, with 9,083 killed and 15,779 injured. The actual figures are likely to be considerably higher. The vast majority of civilian casualties are a result of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects. The missile attack in central Kramatorsk on 27th of June, which killed 12 people, is a case in point. The Secretary General has unequivocally urged all sides to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as such use is highly likely to result in indiscriminate harm. I take this opportunity to refer to the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, adopted in November 2022. In addition to the thousands of civilians killed and injured, the continued and intensified attacks against critical infrastructure and essential services, including energy infrastructure, health and educational facilities, roads and bridges, is alarming. Mines and explosive remnants of war have resulted in widespread land contamination, rendering land unusable for agriculture, while impeding the movement of people. The destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam is possibly the most significant incident of damage to civilian infrastructure since the start of the war. Under international humanitarian law, parties to an armed conflict are prohibited from targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure and have the responsibility to take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid or at least minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. The United Nations strongly condemns attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and call for their immediate cessation. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the past 16 months has seen immense loss, suffering, and devastation in Ukraine. As the conflict has intensified, diplomatic efforts and initiatives by member states seeking de-escalation and calling for a peaceful settlement have also increased. the United Nations stands ready to support all meaningful efforts to bring a just and sustainable peace to Ukraine. In this, we are guided by international law, including the Charter of the United Nations and relevant General Assembly resolutions, as the Secretary General has repeatedly emphasized. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Max Blumenthal.
Thank you, and I thank Alex Rubenstein and Wyatt Reed for helping me prepare this address. Wyatt Reed is a journalistic colleague of mine who, in October 2022, happened to be in Donetsk when his hotel was shelled by the Ukrainian military with a apparently U.S.-made howitzer, nearly killing him. He was 100 meters away. I'm also here with my friend, the civil rights activist Randy Kretiko, who was more recently in Donetsk and witnessed regular HIMARS attacks on civilian targets. I am here not only as a journalist who has spent over 20 years writing books, producing documentaries, and writing articles about conflict and politics from several continents. I'm also here as an American taxpayer who's been dragooned into funding a proxy war that has become a threat to the regional and international stability at the expense of my countrymen and women. Just June 28th, as emergency crews worked to clean up yet another toxic train derailment in the United States, this time on the Montana River, further exposing our nation's chronically underfunded infrastructure and its threats to our health, the Pentagon announced plans to send an additional $500 million worth of military aid to Ukraine. The development came as Ukraine's army enters the third week of a vaunted counteroffensive that CNN describes as, quote, not meeting expectations, and which even Volodymyr Zelensky says is going slower than desired. As Ukraine's military failed to breach Russia's primary defense line, CNN reported on June 12th that Kiev had lost, quote, lost 16 U.S.-made armored vehicles sent to the country. So what did the Pentagon do? It simply passed that bill down to average U.S. taxpayers like myself, charging us another $325 million to replace Ukraine's squandered military stock. There was zero effort to consult the U.S. public's position on the matter, and the vast majority of Americans likely did not even know the exchange took place. This policy that I'm describing to you, which sees Washington prioritize unrestrained funding for a proxy war with a nuclear power in a foreign land while our domestic infrastructure falls apart before our eyes, exposes a disturbing dynamic at the heart of the Ukraine conflict, an international Ponzi scheme that enables Western elites to seize hard-earned wealth from the hands of average U.S. citizens and funnel it into the coffers of a foreign government that even Transparency International ranks as consistently one of the most corrupt in Europe. The U.S. government has yet to conduct an official audit of its funding for Ukraine. The American public has no idea where their tax dollars are going. And that's why this week, we at the Gray Zone published an independent audit of U.S. tax dollar allocation to Ukraine throughout the fiscal years 2022 and 23. Our investigation was led by Heather Kaiser, a former military intelligence officer who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. We found, among many bizarre payments, a $4.5 million payment from the U.S. Social Security Administration to the Kiev government. We found $4.5 billion worth of payments from the U.S. Agency for International Development to pay off Ukraine's sovereign debt, much of which is owned by the global investment firm BlackRock. That amounts to $30 taken from every U.S. citizen at a time when 4 in 10 Americans cannot afford a $400 emergency. We found tax dollars earmarked for Ukraine, padding the budgets of a television station in Toronto, a pro-NATO think tank in Poland, and believe it or not, even rural farmers in Kenya. We found tens of millions to private equity firms, including one in the Republic of Georgia, as well as $1 million payment to a single private entrepreneur in Kiev. Our audit also revealed the Pentagon's $4.5 million contract with a company called Atlantic Diving Supply to provide Ukraine with unspecified explosives equipment. This is a notoriously corrupt company that none other than Tom Tillis, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, previously lambasted for its, quote, history of fraud. Yet once again, Congress has failed to ensure these shady payments and massive arms deals are properly tracked. In fact, much of the military and humanitarian aid shipped to Ukraine has simply vanished. Last year, CBS News quoted the director of a pro-Zelensky nonprofit in Ukraine who reported that only 30% of aid was reaching the front lines. The embezzlement of funds and supplies is at least as troubling as the potential consequences of the illicit transfer and sales of military-grade weapons. Last June, the head of Interpol warned that the massive transfers of arms into Ukraine means, quote, we can expect an influx of weapons in Europe and beyond, and that criminals are now, as we speak, focusing on them. This May, a group of anti-Kremlin Russian exiles outfitted with gear supplied by the Ukrainian government was hailed by Western politicians for carrying out terrorist attacks in Russian territory using American-made Humvees. Although the group, the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps, is led by a man who calls himself the, quote, White King, and includes numerous open admirers of Adolf Hitler, described as neo-Nazis in U.S. mainstream media, the Western weaponization of this militia against Russian forces and Russian civilians has not prompted any outcry from Congress. And while the Biden administration has promised that it's keeping tabs on the weapons sent, a State Department cable leaked last December conceded that, quote, kinetic activity and active combat between Ukrainian and Russian forces create an environment in which standard verification measures are sometimes impracticable or impossible. The Biden administration not only knows that it cannot track the weapons it's shipping to Ukraine, it knows that it is escalating a proxy war against the world's largest nuclear power and daring it to respond in kind. We know this because back in 2014, and this timeline is so important, that's when NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the war started following a U.S.-backed coup d'etat. President Barack Obama rejected demands from Kiev to send lethal offensive weaponry because, as the Wall Street Journal put it, he had a, quote, long-standing concern that arming Ukraine would provoke Moscow into further escalation that would drag Washington into a proxy war. When Donald Trump entered office in 2017, he attempted to hold the line on Barack Obama's policy, but was soon branded a Russian puppet by the Beltway press corps and the Democratic Party for refusing to send Raytheon's Javelin missiles to the Ukrainian military. His reluctance to send the Javelins became a central theme of his impeachment, and he predictably relented. As U.S.-made offensive weaponry began to reach the front lines of the Donbass, the collective West exploited the Minsk Accords to, quote, give Ukraine time to arm up, as the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel put it. In January 2022, the U.S. announced a $200 million arms package to Ukraine. Follow the timeline. By the 18th of February, observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe reported a doubling in ceasefire violations, with OSCE maps showing the overwhelming majority of targeted sites on the side of pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk and Lugansk. 5 days later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And since then, the U.S. and its allies have been scurrying up the escalation ladder at every opportunity. Quote, things we couldn't give in January because it was escalatory were given in February, a former State Department official complained after meeting with Ukrainian counterparts. And things we couldn't give in February, we can in April. That has been the distinct pattern, starting with, for crying out loud, Stingers, referring to shoulder-mounted rockets. Joe Biden himself said in March 2022, the idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks, don't kid yourself. No matter what you all say, that's called World War III. Just over a year later, Biden changed his tune, backing a plan to provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, and after pressuring Germany to send in the tanks he once feared would provoke World War III. It would only take 2 months from the time Ukraine received HIMARS, Lockheed-made HIMARS systems for the U.S. for the Ukrainian military to begin targeting critical infrastructure, using them to strike the Antonovsky Bridge over the Dnipro River, and again 2 months later in a test strike on the Kakhovka Dam to see if the Dnipro's water could be raised enough to stymie Russian crossings, as the Washington Post reported. 3 weeks ago, the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed, triggering a major environmental catastrophe that caused mass flooding and contamination of the local water supply. Ukraine, of course, blames Russia for this attack, but has produced no evidence. Around this time, Ukraine also baselessly accused Russia of planning a provocation at the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. This triggered a resolution by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, no relation to me, calling for NATO to intervene directly in Ukraine and attack Russia if such an incident occurred. The move by Blumenthal and Graham thus established a de facto red line for initiating U.S. military action, much like the one set down in Syria, which, as a former U.S. diplomat commented to journalist Charles Glass, was an open invitation to a false flag. Will we see another Duma deception, but this time in Zaporozhye? This time with nuclear consequences? Why are we doing this? Why are we tempting nuclear annihilation by flooding Ukraine with advanced weapons and sabotaging negotiations at every turn? We've been told by people like Senator Dick Durbin that Ukraine is literally in a battle for freedom and democracy itself, and therefore anyone who opposes military aid to Ukraine opposes the very defense of democracy, according to this logic. So where's the democracy in Vladimir Zelensky's decision to ban opposition parties, to criminalize the media outlets of his legitimate political opponents, to jail his top political rival and his deputies, to raid Orthodox churches and jail clergymen? Where is the democracy in the Ukrainian government's imprisonment of Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen, simply for challenging the official narrative of Ukraine's war? And where is the democracy in Zelensky's recent decision to suspend elections in 2024 on the grounds that martial law has been declared? The answer is that Ukrainian democracy is harder to find these days than that country's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny. Senator Lindsey Graham has offered a much more grim and more on-the-mark rationale for supplying Ukraine with billions in weapons. As the senator boasted during a recent visit with Zelensky in Kiev, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. I repeat, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. And Graham has also said that Americans are ready to fight this war down to the last Ukrainian. While official casualty numbers are strictly classified, we must worry that Ukraine is well on its way to fulfilling the senator's ghoulish fantasies. As a Ukrainian soldier complained this month to Vice News, we don't know what Zelensky's plans are, but, quote, it looks like the extermination of its own population, like of the combat-ready and working-age population. That's it. Indeed, military cemeteries in Ukraine are expanding almost as rapidly as the Northern Virginia McMansions and beachfront estates of executives from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and assorted Beltway contractors benefiting from the second highest level of military spending since World War II. These are the real winners of the Ukraine proxy war, not average Ukrainians or Americans or Russians. The winners, or Europeans for that matter, the winners are people like Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who spent his time between the Obama and Biden administrations launching a consulting firm called West Exec Advisors, which secured lucrative government contracts for intelligence firms and the arms industry. Blinken's former partners at West Exec include Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, CIA Deputy Director David Cohen, former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and almost a dozen current and former members of Biden's national security team. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, for his part, is a former and possibly future board member of Raytheon, and an ex-partner of Pine Island Capital Investment, which collaborates with West Exec and which Blinken himself has advised. Meanwhile, the current U.S. ambassador to this body, the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, is listed as a senior counsel at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a self-described commercial diplomacy firm that also finesses government contracts for the intelligence and arms sector, and which was founded by Madeleine Albright, infamously known for her comments that the deaths by sanctions of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. So while military-age Ukrainian men are ripped off the streets by military police and sent to the front lines, the financially and politically connected architects of this proxy war are planning to walk through the revolving door to reap unimaginable profits once their time in the Biden administration is over. For them, a negotiated settlement to this territorial dispute means an end to the cash cow of close to $150 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine. So in closing, when the United States, my country, a permanent member of this council, has fallen under the control of a bipartisan regime which seeks to perpetuate a proxy war for as long as it takes, in the words of Joe Biden, which considers diplomacy synonymous with unilateral coercive measures to, quote, turn the ruble to rubble, as Biden pledged to do, whose leadership subverts negotiations in order to pursue profit while refusing to properly inform its own citizens what they're paying for, and pushes the sons and brothers of its supposed Ukrainian partners out onto a killing field in order to bludgeon a geopolitical rival, when both Zelensky and members of U.S. Congress are calling for preemptive strikes on Russia, which have nothing to do with Article 51 of the UN Charter, this Council must take action to enforce that charter. That charter is clear that the Security Council must use its authority to guarantee a pacific settlement of dispute, particularly when it threatens international security. That should not only apply to Russia and Ukraine. This Council has an obligation to strictly monitor and restrain the U.S. and the illegal military formation known as NATO. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Blumenthal for his briefing. I would like to remind the briefers to limit their interventions to 10 minutes. I now give the floor to Mr. Che Baus. Mr. Baus, we don't hear you.
Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Baus.
Sorry about that. Well, thank you for asking me to appear, ladies and gentlemen and chairman. And despite well over a year of frenzied and what is now recognized as loosely regulated supply of incalculable numbers of weapons to Ukraine, sources within the country still maintain that it needs an escalating volume of heavy and light weapons and ammunition to conduct its operations. And it's now glaringly apparent that what began as NATO supporting a Ukrainian military that it had built since the beginning of the civil war in the East in 2014 has now in real terms become a proxy conflict where Ukraine supplies manpower with ever-diminishing operational capability to support a de facto NATO operation to prevent a Russian military victory in Ukraine, and thus avert the potentially terminal impact such a victory would have on the operational, political, and reputational survival of NATO itself. It's critical that the reality of this situation is seen for what it actually is. This is indeed the very real escalating concern of NATO planners and their political funders, particularly in the ever hawkish Anglosphere. And this geostrategic reality also, of course, drives the seemingly perpetual escalation of military aid to Ukraine. All of this is despite tens of billions of dollars of weapons in various states of operability already being delivered to a country which the US State Department has described as endemically corrupt and in many sectors of society essentially lawless. And this was as recent as 2019. And it's crucially important that we are clear as to the kind of country these vast amounts of weapons are being delivered into. And I'd like to quote directly from their report in 2019 entitled Country Reports on Human Rights Practices, Department of State, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labour. And this is a shocking report that maintains that unlawful and arbitrary killings and torture are widespread, as are the abuse of detainees by law enforcement personnel, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prisons and detention centres, arbitrary arrest and detention, substantial problems with the independence of the judiciary, restrictions on freedom of expression, the press, the internet, including violence against journalists, censorship, the blocking of websites, the control of the press is widespread. It goes on to cite serious concerns regarding government corruption and crimes involving violence or the threat of violence targeting persons with disabilities, ethnic minorities, which I presume includes the Russian-speaking minority in the east of the country, and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex community. And it's into this cauldron that the Western powers are pouring incalculable volumes of weapons and munitions and money. On the front lines, meanwhile, the military progress for the now serially depleted Ukrainian military is undeniably strategically insignificant, particularly in the context of the long-vaunted and publicized counteroffensive, where all qualified and objective, independent and non-aligned analysts must agree Ukraine is failing to achieve even the necessary initial breakthroughs against well-prepared and well-resourced Russian lines of defense. It's very interesting to hear the paid expert contributors in Western media encouraging an almost perverse, stiff upper lip, look the other way attitude when faced with the undeniably brutal losses Ukraine has and has undeniably suffered. These young men dying in their thousands are, in my considered view, the foremost victims of this perpetual escalation in military aid to Ukraine, as they attempt to advance in close order, in daylight, across minefields, into pre-zeroed artillery kill zones, often in 30-year-old second-rate NATO-supplied armoured personnel carriers, like the US M113, a lightly armoured steel box, first entering service in 1960 and a veteran of another US foreign policy disaster, the Vietnam War. These may be accompanied by a handful of German Leopard tanks, many of which are decades old and grossly unsuited to the Ukrainian steppe, or maybe by what are supposed to be mine-resistant vehicles, all of which have been shown now to be exceptionally vulnerable to Russian anti-tank warfare systems, attack helicopters, and the brutal reality of in-depth Russian minefields. All of this occurs with no meaningful air support, let alone air supremacy, which Russia commands with its in-depth air defense systems and a large fleet of modern multi-role fighters. The idea that these assaults, which are essentially amounting to suicidal full frontal attacks on in-depth prepared defenses, are allowed to continue is, in my view, deeply cynical and I would suggest sinister. No modern NATO military strategist or senior officer would suggest these maneuvers are anything but an inhumane ticket to tragedy when commanding their own troops. Yet, when it comes to these Ukrainian young men mounting these assaults being decimated, they are silent. They accept the Ukrainian government's ban on reporting from the front lines on the vast losses in men and material that evoke scenes more familiar with the Somme or Passchendaele. As increasingly depleted Ukraine can indeed defeat Russia on the battlefield, this ideology is a delusion. In eastern and southern Ukraine, somehow reclaim Crimea and subsume an unwilling ethnic Russian population back into a chaotic and essentially failed state governed from Kiev. The quality of some of the equipment which the United States has urged its smaller NATO allies to donate to Ukraine is at best repairable and at worst outright lethal. Not to the Russian defenders, but to the Ukrainian operators. Several of these incentive deals have been done to entice NATO countries to dump older vehicles into a desperate Ukraine on the promise of replacement with better or at least younger equipment. In one case, Germany replaced 40 BMP-1A1s, one of the oldest versions of this Soviet troop carrier, for the Greek army with 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles through a Ringtausch program. The Soviet-era armor then being forwarded to Ukraine. The same type of deals have been widespread regarding the hasty requirement to feed Ukraine's Soviet-era artillery, such as the Grad MLRS system, with post-Soviet states in Eastern Europe offering hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery and rockets to the country in return for replacement systems. Surely the morality of this is deeply questionable. Of course, there is one fiscal beneficiary, and that is, of course, the NATO military-industrial complex, of which the United States is by far the biggest player globally. A recent New York Times article has outlined how profiteering and incompetence has further complicated the chaotic landscape in Ukraine when it comes to the flood of heavy and light weapons into the country. According to it, and I quote, Ukraine has paid contractors hundreds of millions of dollars for weapons that have not been delivered. And in some of the much publicized arms donated by its allies have been so decrepit that they were deemed fit only to be cannibalized for spare parts or indeed scrapped. The Ukrainian government has revealed documents that show, as at the end of last year, Kiev had paid arms suppliers more than $800 million for contracts that went completely or partly unfulfilled. Two of the individuals involved in the purchasing of this equipment, according to the New York Times, said that as of early this spring, hundreds of millions of dollars had been paid, including to state-owned companies, for arms that never materialized. And according to Volodymyr Havrilov, a deputy defense minister, and I quote, "We did have cases where we paid money and we didn't receive any of the weapons." And I would like to point out again, some of these contracts are with state companies, according to the New York Times. And it's very important that we try to show the sheer scale and volume of weapons flooding into Ukraine since last year. The United States alone has committed well over $40 billion worth of military aid to the Kiev government. The EU and other states have also contributed tens of billions into what we know to be one of the least regulated states on earth when it comes to control of corruption and institutional accountability. In addition, Ukraine has spent billions of dollars of its own money on the private arms market, possibly the most difficult area to ascertain any kind of transparency in. It's worth recalling that over the 20-year period of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, the U.S. Department of Defense paid various companies about $108 billion in contracts for work performed in the country, with 1/3 of those contracts spending remarkably going to undisclosed recipients, domestic and foreign businesses who are not uniquely identified in the publicly available contracting databases. This information is from a landmark piece of work done by the Watson Institute for International Affairs, Brown University in Rhode Island in the USA, in their cost of war research on the Afghan misadventure. These vast sums would suggest to the novice taxpayer that Ukraine is receiving high-tech supplies, but in a reflection of the poor quality of Western donations and the brutal battlefield attrition rate, as much as 30% of Kiev's arsenal is under repair at any given time. And that's according to a source reported again by the New York Times in a separate article. It also suggests that a recent delivery of 33 self-propelled howitzers donated by the Italian government were basically only good for scrap, and that the Italian Defense Ministry had stated that the vehicles had been decommissioned several years ago, many years ago, but the Ukraine had asked for them anyway to be overhauled and put into operation, given the urgent need for a means to face Russian aggression. In a Pentagon Inspector General's report released last May, also illustrates some of these serious issues. An American unit was supposed to ship 29 Humvees, a very small amount of equipment to Ukraine from a depot in Kuwait. The cost of this action bears no remote link to any sort of strategic imperative whatsoever. By the time it actually arrived in Poland, only 3 of the vehicles were actually battle-worthy. The tires were rotten on them all, and they had to be replaced at huge cost and basically choking up the whole supply chain. The same thing has happened with M777 howitzers, which were a much vaunted game changer in the long line of much vaunted game changers that were going to turn the tide of the war in Ukraine, according to the Western media. Instead, the M777 howitzer has become a sitting duck for Russian loitering munitions, and we have verifiable evidence that over 100 of these units have been destroyed in the field in Ukraine. And by the way, the Pentagon report also says that at least one of the M777 howitzers was in such a bad shape it would have killed the operators trying to use it. And that is in the inspector's report that was concluded in March 2022. Similarly, Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace announcing the planned transfer of AS-90 howitzers in Ukraine to great fanfare. We stand with Ukraine. In fact, when we look into this transfer, we see that these howitzers were unserviceable in varying states of readiness, and they ended up being scrapped or used for spare parts. So the haphazard distribution now of small arms across the country is probably more disturbing, if not more so, in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. Long before the Russian military operation in Ukraine began last February, various reports were highlighting the dangers to civil society of the widespread distribution of small arms and ammunition across the country. Now, Max Blumenthal has referred to some of this. In February 2022, Ukrainian authorities remarkably began to distribute tens of thousands of assault weapons, rifles, grenades, and millions of rounds of ammunition to the general population. In one incident alone, 6 kilometers from the center of Kiev, thousands of weapons were distributed to anybody willing to carry them. Some 18,000 portable assault weapons, rifles, and pistols with ammunition were handed out to untrained civilians within days of the Russian intervention. This was confirmed by Ukraine's Interior Ministry advisor, Vadim Denisko, to the BBC. It's impossible to imagine or even speculate as to the volume of illicit and official small arms now circulating in the country. A country, again, experiencing catastrophic levels of dysfunction and destruction, criminality and corruption. I don't need to cite the various Interpol reports. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu suggesting that there are Western anti-tank weapons now on the borders of Israel in the hands of the enemies of Israel. I won't quote those because they're widely and they've been mentioned by other briefers. But this leads to my next point, which I'm anxious to make regarding the potential destructive power of every single military-grade weapon in the wrong hands. The unthinkable destruction of a single anti-aircraft weapon could have on the periphery of any European airport. We've all seen the tragic consequences of the brutal terror attacks at the Bataclan Theatre in Paris in November 2015, where 130 innocent civilians died and 416 were injured. The attackers carried Zastava M70 assault rifles, which had been previously deactivated and reactivated for the attacks. The M70 is a Serbian copy of the Kalashnikov rifle, the most common weapon now circulating in the tens of hundreds of thousands in Ukraine. It's a lethal and capable weapon, easy to use, easy to conceal, and in the wrong hands, capable of delivering catastrophic destruction and firepower. Unfortunately, given the huge scale of the saturation of Ukrainian society with such weapons, it's absolutely inevitable that significant numbers of these weapons have and will continue to be sold on the black market to the highest bidders, particularly in a society racked by conflict, societal breakdown, and the ensuing lawlessness that brings. It doesn't take vast numbers of weapons to cause significant civil strife and lead to severe local and potentially national escalation of conflict. In my own country, British forces colluded with loyalist paramilitary gangs through the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s to terrorize and murder hundreds of innocent civilians over decades with relatively minuscule amounts of weaponry, actually less than hundreds of firearms. The Irish Republican Army was able to mount a serious threat to the British state itself with relatively small amounts of weapons and explosives. Thousands were killed and injured during a decades-long conflict sustained by a relatively small arsenal of weaponry. When the IRA decommissioned its arsenal, it was found to have only 1,000 rifles, 2 tons of Semtex explosive, and 7 surface-to-air missiles. Yet this was enough to mount a sustained and significant threat to the British state. As I've mentioned many times, more weapons were handed out over a period of days to civilians in Kiev in the context of the Ukrainian conflict than these numbers themselves. They're absolutely minuscule, but they demonstrate the potential for a relatively small armed group on either side to exert disproportionate influence in any post-conflict period, which could lead to the collapse of any accommodation or agreement. It is the proliferation of these weapons that potentially could lead to decades of instability, not only in other parts of Europe and further afield, but in Ukraine itself. Finally, and to wind up, I recently spent some time in the city of Belgorod, which has come under sustained attack from Ukrainian artillery and drones. I visited the town of Shebekino and a large displaced person centres the government is providing to tens of thousands of ordinary civilians that had to flee their homes due to the indiscriminate shelling of civilian targets. I've stood with an 83-year-old woman as she asked me what she had done to deserve a high explosive drone to target her home in a civilian tower block in Voronezh, a Ukrainian drone. I've seen those villages burning. I've heard the artillery strike, and I have to tell you that weapons being supplied by NATO and their allies to Ukraine are being willfully targeted against civilian populations on a daily basis in Donbass, Lugansk, Belgorod, all miraculously invisible to the Western media. It's incumbent on all here that have any influence to convey the reality of the conflict to their own people, to avoid the increasingly dangerous spiral of escalation that leads us further towards the absolutes at the expense of compromise. I owe it to the men and women and children who I've met in the conflict zones, who I have had the privilege to speak to convey the reality of increased militarization in the region. I urge you to seek accommodation and peace, to respect the democratic mandate of those who have expressed it. Settlement will come, and it's my absolute belief that it's up to those in Washington and London, now fueling the conflict with endless escalatory military aid to Ukraine, to decide where and when that settlement occurs, either at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. We have an expression in Ireland: he who pays the piper calls the tune. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Bose for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Sergei Radchenko.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Radchenko, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Mr. President, Excellencies, it is an honor to speak to the Council and to follow such loquacious presentations. Russia is conducting a war of aggression against Ukraine, a terrible war that has already cost many tens of thousands of lives. Russia has resorted to indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Its troops have committed atrocities, including torture, rapes, and killing. Russia has violated principles of the United Nations, which it helped craft at the end of the Second World War. Just yesterday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed in an interview that no one has ever sent him the list of rules for the rules-based international order. Mr. President, this list exists. It is called the Charter of the United Nations, and here's what it says, and I quote, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other matter inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations." The UN Charter was signed on June 26, 1945, in the wake of the most destructive war the world has ever seen, a war of those who sought to enslave the world by conquest and brutality against those who stood up against aggression, who fought shoulder to shoulder for their freedom and dignity. In July 1937, after several years of gradual encroachment through creation of various puppet states, Imperial Japan invaded the Republic of China. The Japanese armies brutally fought their way across China. The Chinese government appealed for international help and received it. None other than Moscow provided China with hundreds of aircraft and even pilots who played a crucial role in the Chinese resistance effort, and in particular in the Battle of Wuhan in the spring of 1938. Were it not for Soviet and later American help, the aggressor would have triumphed and China would have fallen. After World War II broke out in Europe and German armies laid waste to neighboring countries, the United States stepped up to the task, both by committing its troops and also, crucially, by providing Lend-Lease aid to those countries fighting against Hitler's aggression, including the Soviet Union. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States provided the Soviet Union with $11 billion worth of aid, which is over $200 billion in today's dollars, an amount second only to that provided to the United Kingdom. This aid included over 14,000 airplanes, 12,000 armored vehicles, including 7,000 tanks, over 8,000 artillery pieces, including anti-aircraft weapons, over 400,000 jeeps and trucks, and 197 torpedo boats. Now, policymakers in Berlin may well have been concerned at the time that such an ambitious effort by the United States prolonged the war because it made it more difficult for Germany to defeat and enslave the Soviet Union. But it is worth reiterating that these supplies were the Soviet Union's lifeline. Without them, the Soviet Union would have most certainly been overrun by the Third Reich. The United Nations would never have won, and Mr. Max Blumenthal and Mr. Che Bowis would never have joined us today to tell us about the heavy, very heavy, completely unacceptable burden of supporting freedom. Why are we doing this, Mr. Blumenthal asks rhetorically. I'll tell you, Mr. Blumenthal, so that you, Mr. Bowis, can come here and tell us how terrible it is to support a victim of unprovoked aggression, how terrible it is to help people under attack, how terrible it is to resist imperialist conquest. Mr. President, I'm a historian, and historians bring the past to the present so that we gain a better understanding of what the future may hold. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not a historically unprecedented development. Wars of aggression happened before. Unprovoked invasions happened before. They tend to have consequences. One of their consequences is the tendency of the invaded party to resist the invader and to ask for outside assistance. We know that this idea was enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, one of those that no one has sadly showed to Sergei Lavrov, but one that speaks of, and I quote, the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense, end quote. It is by that inherent right that Ukraine has turned to the world with a plea for help. It is by that inherent right that so many nations have contributed to Ukraine's defense by sending much-needed military aid. If anything, they have not gone far enough, for Russia continues to occupy internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, posing a grave threat to international peace and security. The great Karl von Clausewitz, who incidentally served in the Russian army during the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, had once noted that the aggressor, and I quote, is always peace-loving. That is, he would like to invade his neighbors peacefully unless there's organized resistance. Господин председатель, Clausewitz был прав.
President, Clausewitz was right. Russian complaints regarding external support to Ukraine do not detract from the following facts. 1. The Russian Federation invaded Ukraine on trumped-up reasons, not the opposite. Second, the Russian Federation continues to violate international law, waging a war of aggression against a neighboring state. Third, the Russian Federation is continuing to bomb Ukrainian cities, including Kramatorsk just yesterday, where the Russian Federation destroyed civilian infrastructure, specifically a restaurant. As a result, innocent civilians perished. 3 children were in their ranks. Fourth, the Russian Federation has been so bold as to demand that the West does not supply Ukraine with weapons to defend itself against a treacherous attack. The next fact is that the Security Council can differentiate between truth and lies. It can differentiate between those who are truly peace-loving and those who are talking about striving for peace, but actually waging war. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Radchenko for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
President, at the outset, we should like to thank Ms. Nakamitsu, Mr. Blumenthal, and Mr. Bose for their comprehensive statements, specifically those from the two briefers. Mr. Radchenko, to whom I'd like to say the following. Let's not be hypocritical regarding the rules-based international order. The rules-based international order is not the UN Charter. It's a set of rules thought up by a small number of countries, Western countries, which are being portrayed as universal. So in principle, we don't quite understand, whereas the two briefers spoke to the topic at hand, gave us useful details regarding weapon supplies to Ukraine, the way it's being financed. Mr. Radchenko took us on a historical lecture. He gave us a historical lecture, so we don't understand the reason for that. As we just heard from our briefers, not all of them, of course, threats stemming from Western weapons being supplied to Ukraine are continuing to grow and multiply. As our ex-Western partners continue to make incessant attempts to shift all blame for what's going on in Ukraine onto Russia. Inconsistencies in the narrative they're promoting are clear. Western countries are doggedly trying to make the international community forget that the crisis in Ukraine, just like Western supplies to Kiev, began long before the special military operation. Today, thanks to revelations from a whole host of high-ranking politicians at the time, we know that the planned pumping of Ukraine full of weapons and work to prepare it for war with Russia was going on all these years, concealed by the Minsk Accords, despite the fact that these accords were backed up by concomitant UN Security Council resolutions, although neither the Western countries nor Kiev ever intended to implement them. All the while, civilians in the Donbass were subjected to mass shelling. Russia, of course, could not remain indifferent. Today, Kiev's Western patrons are trying to put a new spin on the state of affairs, saying that they only began to arm Ukraine when the special military operation began in order to repel the so-called Russian aggression. This scheme, over the last 18 months, it's become to something akin to a private military company entitled Ukraine. NATO supplies weapons, mainly using their old stockpiles, financing their military companies on the sly. These companies are making exorbitant profits, whereas the ones fighting and dying by the tens of thousands in the battlefield are Ukrainians. Our briefers already mentioned that Senator Lindsey Graham, when he met with the head of the Kiev regime, called the scheme and the resulting deaths of Russians the best money the US has ever spent in its efforts to help Ukraine. Today, the cumulative amount of military assistance the US and its allies have provided to Ukraine is over $55 billion. The fact that these weapons are being used to shell civilian infrastructure and are resulting in civilian deaths, and there is a great deal of evidence, in fact, to back that up, well, the West is unruffled by this, the so-called peace-loving West. The West is not only pumping the Kiev regime full of weapons in an unbridled fashion, it's also training Ukrainian armed forces and nationalist battalions on their own territory. They're providing intelligence to the Ukrainian army for target setting. They're even approving strikes conducted using Western weapons. And yet they're assiduously asserting that the West is not involved in this conflict. Supposedly, they're neutral. And yet international law, including the provisions of the Hague Conventions dated 1907 and the norms of customary international law, are unequivocal. They prohibit such action by neutral states. Commission of such acts mean that these states will lose their neutral status and will become parties to an armed conflict. As justification, our former partners are putting forward the following argument. They say that the 1907 Hague Convention is supposedly terribly outdated. It's very strange to hear that from states, the military agencies of which are regularly updating and reissuing heavy tomes dedicated to the laws and customs of war. These tomes include lengthy sections about the rights and duties of neutral states, including the norms of these supposedly outdated conventions. Let me underscore, these are not publications containing doctrine. These documents are practical guidelines for army and flotilla commanders. which call for the harshest measures to be taken in response to neutrality being violated, including the use of force. The 1907 Convention are international agreements which are in force. They have not been abrogated. Their main objective is to prevent the spread of armed conflicts, to prevent a growing number of states being pulled into such conflicts. Today, these conventions are more relevant than ever. After all, the collective West has proclaimed that its objective is to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia in the battlefield. Their madcap statements are accompanied with irresponsible actions. We're tempted to call this playing with fire, but it's actually worse than that. In their militaristic frenzy, having become completely untethered from reality, the West is deliberately provoking a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Another argument is based on branding our country as the aggressor, referring to the resolution adopted at the 11th Extraordinary Special Session of the UNGA. The US has started a record number of aggressive wars throughout its history, and yet they're proclaiming that you can help the so-called victim of the aggression without losing your neutral status. Any self-respecting international lawyer will find such arguments laughable, and it's not to do with the fact that the support from the West to these non-consensus documents, which are actually recommendations, vanish into thin air as soon as you become well-versed in the real reasons of the Ukrainian crisis. It's not the fact that the US and its satellites are the architects and main beneficiaries of the situation. In fact, the main problem is that the UN General Assembly is, in principle, not empowered, pursuant to the UN Charter, to determine that an aggression has occurred. Such qualifications are in violation of the provisions of the Charter and are nugatory ab initio. So this label, aggressor, is not a legal qualification. It's in fact a political assessment without any legal foundation. Everything that's been built on this argument, so-called qualified neutrality, all of that crumbles. And if we are talking about value judgment assessments, the aggressor is the one who organized a bloody pro-fascist coup in a neighboring country and turned the resulting state in an enemy of Russia and an enemy of everything that's Russian. History, culture, language, and even the Orthodox faith. The one who trained fighters, including vile neo-Nazi battalions, supplied them with weapons long before February of 2022, knowing that these weapons were going to be used against peace-loving civilians in the Donbass. Also, NATO is trying to portray itself as a strictly a body that exists strictly for self-defense. It sounds like a bad joke given the lengthy track record of unprovoked and unjust military aggressions with the involvement of NATO. What also doesn't hold water is the Western legal doctrine, according to which collective self-defense is being invoked under Article 51. There are two key questions here. We didn't receive a notification here at the Security Council, according to which the Charter, such a notification should be immediate. Thus, it would mean that if you are engaging in self-defense, well, that would be equivalent to acknowledging that you are at war with our country. What's more interesting, references to countermeasures under international law. As you know, these should be commensurate. What sort of damage did Russia do to the US and to the EU to justify the death of our citizens at the hands of Western weapons, and the sabotage, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, or the terrorist attacks against prominent public persons in the Russian Federation? We suggest that the authors of these speculative constructs to ask themselves, what should Russia's response to these countermeasures be? President, today our former partners here at the Security Council are likely going to talk about how they're committed to settling the crisis in Ukraine, and yet the Western countries are promoting a narrative which cannot be squared with the fact that back in the spring of last year in Istanbul, heads of the Ukrainian negotiating delegation actually initialed a peace agreement. This document was publicly demonstrated by the President of the Russian Federation at a recent meeting with African leaders. After the Kiev regime, under pressure from its Western sponsors, went back on these agreements and also introduced a legislative ban on peace talks with Russia, it became clear that a lasting, sustainable peace in our region is not in the interests of Western states. Well, where does that leave us? Agreeing with Russia on peaceful coexistence, becoming neutral, a state which doesn't threaten anybody, a non-aligned state? Well, the Western states didn't allow Ukraine to do that in March of last year. On the contrary, they're arming this country in an insane calculation that it's going to vanquish Russia. Western technology that's been supplied to Kiev is perishing on the battlefield, and in fact, Ukraine has almost run out of Ukrainian and other Soviet equipment. For instance, today, the Prime Minister of Latvia, just before our meeting, said, and here I quote, Ukraine has already been integrated into NATO as far as weapons are concerned. And we cannot but agree, because Ukraine can only fight using the weapons being supplied by the West and by NATO. It has hardly any other weaponry. The head of European diplomacy, Mr. Borrell, the beacon of European diplomacy, Mr. Borrell, today stated that the EU is considering the possibility of turning the European Peace Fund into a Ukrainian defense fund. What we would advise Mr. Borrell, and in fact we've done this in the past, not to stop halfway and to engage in temporary decisions and to rename the European Peace Fund and call it the European War Fund. The Ukraine does not have any of its own weapons left, but there are still some Ukrainians which are being sent into battle like lambs to the slaughter as part of the so-called counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces, which the Ukrainians call the Zaporizhia meat grinder. Kiev can mobilize some more people, yet this is going to soon be the case. This is lamentable. They're running out of space at Ukrainian cemeteries. And this bloodshed, the only people who want it is the West. It was imposed on Ukraine for one reason, so that there can be at least something that they can talk about, some success to report at the upcoming NATO summit in mid-July. There, Western governments will be able to assert that the huge sums being spent in Ukraine are not being spent for nothing. And more weapons will be sent to Ukraine, which again will be destroyed on the battlefield, like the weapons the UAF has right now. The balance of power will not be altered by these supplies, as most independent military experts have already acknowledged publicly that Kiev's defeat is a question of time. And a question of time, of course, is also the number of victims at the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces, which will be sacrificed in vain. Western propaganda peddlers are continuing to promote senseless and empty slogans, saying that Ukraine can win, although they couldn't care less. All they want to do is to weaken Russia. Of course, in our opponent's war chest, they still have high-profile sham terrorist attacks trying to pin the blame on Russia, such as Bucha and the Kavkazskaya GES NPP situation. God forbid a disaster is provoked at the Zaporizhia NPP, which would result in great suffering and the loss of many lives. Today, we disseminated a letter as a UN Security Council document, which once again confirms that against the backdrop of the insane insinuations of the Kiev regime, we do not intend to blow up this NPP. We have no intention of doing so. In our letter, we call on the UN Secretary-General and the international community to influence Kiev, compelling it to abstain from provocations at the Zaporizhia NPP. So that's the situation we have on our hands. Now that the opportunity for peace was squandered, it was squandered back in March of last year. Well, the conditions of peace for Ukraine will, of course, be quite different. By way of conclusion, I'd like to quote one well-respected, highly experienced European leader. Last year, he said basically the following: Ukraine is no longer a sovereign country. They have neither money nor weapons. They can only fight because we in the West are supporting them. End of quote. The only opportunity to save Ukraine, well, this politician sees it as the following, and here I quote: the Americans must begin negotiations with the Russians so as to sign an agreement on a security architecture which would include space for Ukraine. End of quote. There's not much I can say to that. The good thing is that the bitter truth is finally percolating, reaching Western leaders. Ongoing deliveries of Western weapons will not result in the outcome the West wants: to vanquish Russia on the battlefield, inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. We hope our Western colleagues will realize this as soon as possible. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, for her briefing. We have also taken note of the other presentations. I'll focus on three main points today. First, Switzerland firmly condemns Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. We reject all attempts to justify and distort responsibility for this act and its consequences. With this act, Russia is seriously violating international law, in particular the prohibition of the use of force enshrined in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. Ukraine has the right to ensure its security and defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second, several Council resolutions prohibit arms transfers originating from certain countries, as well as the transfer and the use of these weapons for targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure. These constitute multiple violations of international law. We call on all states to respect their obligations, including the relevant Security Council resolutions. We regret the heavy toll paid by the civilian population in this war. Switzerland calls for strict compliance with international humanitarian law. In the conduct of hostilities, the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution must be respected. We condemn any attack carried out in violation of these principles, and we reaffirm that those responsible for such acts must be brought to justice, and that victims must receive the necessary support for their physical, mental, social, and economic rehabilitation. Third, with General Assembly Resolution ES11/6, we have a broadly supported basis for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. We welcome diplomatic efforts that are being pursued in line with these principles. President, this war is causing immense suffering for the civilian population in Ukraine and is increasing instability throughout the world with unforeseeable consequences, including in Russia. We reiterate our concern about the intention to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. In order that a diplomatic solution can be pursued, we call on Russia once again to de-escalate the situation, cease all combat operations, and withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory without delay. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I wish to thank Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Madam Izumi Nakamitsu, for her informative briefing. We have also taken note of the other briefings. President, it has now been 491 days since the Russian Federation launched its brutal and unrelenting war against Ukraine, bringing about untold suffering to innocent civilians who now live under constant threat of harm to their lives. Apart from the immediate humanitarian crisis, the war has become an axis of renewed geopolitical tensions with far-reaching implications for peace and security in the region of Europe. Away from the battle zone, the war continues to negatively impact the global economy with a persisting rise in food and energy prices and the tightening of international financial and monetary conditions. As confirmed in the briefing to the Council last week, the war now accounts for the displacement of some 10 million people and more than 24,000 civilian casualties. As the Council is often reminded, these numbers are likely to be higher as they represent only those reported through official United Nations sources. There is no scarcity of evidence of the mass destruction that has been caused in many parts of the country. Homes, schools, medical facilities, transport, energy, and other critical infrastructure are being destroyed at an alarming rate and in clear violation of the prohibitions against such actions under international humanitarian law. Presently, rescue efforts are continuing at the site of a missile strike on the restaurant in the city of Kramatorsk, where several people, including children, are reported to have been injured or dead. President, as we know, violent conflicts such as the one pertaining in Ukraine create the conditions for the accumulation of weapons and their diversion from government control to unintended recipients and conflict situations in other parts of the world. It is in this regard that my delegation has, in previous discussions on this subject, urged strict compliance with the Arms Trade Treaty and other international obligations designed to prevent the diversion or illicit transfer of conventional weapons. It is important that in maintaining international peace and security, member states providing defense assistance to Ukraine should implement arms control measures at all stages of weapons transfer, including risk assessment, maintaining records, monitoring and tracking, as well as post-conflict arrangements for disarmament. These measures are necessary to ensure that military support provided in the course of the war serve the singular purpose of strengthening Ukraine's capacity to assert its right to self-defense in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. President, from the very onset of the war, Ghana has struggled to appreciate the different assertions provided by the Russian Federation as justifications for its conduct in Ukraine. We also cannot reconcile with any suggestions that efforts in support of Ukraine's legitimate use of force in the defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity constitute an obstruction to peace efforts. The rules of international law and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations require states to interact on the basis of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and cooperation. All member states, and more particularly the members of the Security Council, have an obligation to respect and uphold the fundamental principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity, which govern interstate relations and provide the foundations for a stable international order. It is on this basis that Ghana continues to call for the cessation of hostilities and urges the Russian Federation to end the war by the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. We also reiterate the absolute necessity for all parties to refrain from targeting civilians and causing further harm to Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. A large number of United Nations member states, including the members of this council, have taken a stand for peace in Ukraine and repeatedly called for a peaceful settlement in line with international law and the core values on which our organization is founded. Much responsibility now lies with the parties to extend themselves beyond their differences and return to the negotiating table in search of a comprehensive and lasting solution. In a postmodern and globalized world, where challenges that confront nations transcend physical and political boundaries, a purely inward-looking approach to security, which appears to be the case, may offer some temporary resolutions, but is unsustainable for the wider maintenance of our collective global security. We therefore encourage the intensification of diplomatic efforts in support of a constructive dialogue that could lead to a durable settlement between the two sides and in the interest of all others. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Thank you, President. And I thank Under-Secretary General Nakamitsu and Dr. Redchenko for their briefings. I'd like to make 3 points. First, the UK government has been clear about the military support that we have provided for the defence of Ukraine. The bravery and endless determination of Ukrainians is their own, but we're proud to support them in their fight to be free. And we're not just providing weapons. Around 17,000 Ukrainian soldiers have received training in the UK since the start of Russia's invasion. And we will also support Ukraine when peace is won to rebuild their country, as we did at the Ukraine Recovery Conference last week, where the international community made over $60 billion worth of commitments. Colleagues, Ukraine continues to need our support. For them, this is a war of survival. For Russia, it is a war of choice. So second, let's remind ourselves how Russia has decided to fight its war of choice. Shelling civilian homes, human wave attacks ordered forward at gunpoint, atrocities left in the wake of its retreating forces, hundreds of civilians arbitrarily detained, over 90% of them reporting torture or ill treatment by Russian captors. On Tuesday, Russian missiles struck a pizza restaurant in Kramatorsk, taking 10 more innocent lives. Among those killed in the attack were two twin sisters, Yulia and Anna Aksenchenko. They were just 14 years old. This week, the Secretary-General published his report on children affected by armed conflict. Russia is part of its working group and knows that this reporting system is among the most rigorous used by the UN. The report is shocking. A permanent member of this council, listed alongside terror groups such as Al-Shabaab and Islamic State, for committing grave violations affecting children in situations of armed conflict. Russian forces have been responsible for killings, abductions, rapes of children as young as 4. 90 times, Russian forces used children as human shields. Every Russian should feel shame at what their army has done in Ukraine. But the Russian army doesn't fight alone. Putin has poured tanks, rockets, anti-aircraft missiles, and every kind of weaponry into the hands of unaccountable mercenary forces, recruited from the ranks of gangsters and convicts. A year ago, Russia denied the Wagner Group's existence. Now, Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion has publicly destroyed Putin's case for the war in Ukraine. And Wagner's march to Moscow showed us just how quickly Russians can leave Ukraine when they choose to. Third, without doubt, diplomatic efforts will be essential to peace, and we note the various ongoing efforts towards peace, including the African leaders' recent visit to Kyiv and Moscow this month. The UK fully supports President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. The only path to sustainable peace is for Putin to withdraw his troops and end the bloodshed now. We will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine as they win a just and sustained peace that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Nakamitsu for her briefing. I also thank the other briefers for their interventions. Brazil shares the concern about the disruptive potential of arms transfer to conflict zones. Our principal position on the subject remains the same. First, we recognize the inherent right of Ukraine and all member states to self-defense. This principle does not exempt us from the obligation enshrined in Article 33 to seek a peaceful solution to disputes through direct negotiations, conciliation, mediation, and any other means that do not involve resorts to arms. Moreover, we have consistently asserted the availability of arms and ammunition may become a long-term destabilizing factor and multiply threats to the security of civilian populations. In this regard, we must recognize the concrete risk of diversion of military equipment to non-state actors, including criminal and terrorist groups. Also, we believe that the Arms Trade Treaty provides the means to curtail illegal transfers and to prevent diversion. It is essential to preserve accurate records and ensure the transparency of transactions. We encourage other member states to take into consideration the provisions of the ATT when proceeding with their arms transfers. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I'd like to thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. Russia alone bears responsibility for this situation. It was Russia that decided, in violation of all the norms of international law and in the name of a crude attempt to rewrite history and to attack a sovereign neighboring country. No one but Russia is seeking to sustain the war against Ukraine. Russia can bring an end to it at any time by withdrawing its troops, as the International Court of Justice demanded over a year ago now. Contrary to what Russia claims, Ukraine has never represented a threat, either to Russia's territorial integrity or to the Russian-speaking populations of Ukraine. Our position remains unchanged. Russia's aggression must not and will not be rewarded, because Russia is flouting the principles of the United Nations, because it is trivializing the use of force, because it heralds a world in which the sovereignty of states depends solely on the balance of power. President, Ukraine did not want war and has done nothing to provoke it. This war is threatening the security of the entire European continent. That's why France, together with its partners, has chosen to resolutely support the Ukrainian people in their legitimate right to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity. These are two principles that lie at the heart of our Charter. We will continue to do so bilaterally and via the European Union for as long as Russian soldiers illegally remain on Ukrainian territory. By focusing our efforts on anti-aircraft capabilities, we are helping the Ukrainian people to defend themselves against Russian strikes on civilian infrastructure. Just the day before yesterday, Russia targeted a restaurant in Kramatorsk with a missile strike that killed at least 11 people and injured 61 others. These systematic strikes on civilian infrastructure constitute war crimes. In recent weeks, we have stepped up our deliveries of arms and ammunition, armoured vehicles, logistical support, and our provision of training. By supporting the Ukrainian counteroffensive, we hope to put Ukraine in a strong position to create the conditions for credible negotiations, leading to a just and lasting peace. Mr. President, to hide its own responsibility, Russia is seeking to divert attention by relying on the analyses of the so-called experts we've heard from today. But to support its aggression, it is procuring Iranian combat drones which it launches against civilian infrastructure. It's secretly buying missiles and ammunition from North Korea. And it's doing all of this in violation of Security Council resolutions. Some of these weapons are being used on the ground by militias funded by the Russian state. Russia is now beginning to count the cost of this choice for itself. It's being attacked by the very instability that it caused. President, this aggression has catastrophic repercussions for Ukraine and for the whole world. But it's also a dead end for Russia, which must realize that our support for Ukraine will not waver, and that there is only one possible outcome here: peace in accordance with the UN Charter, which respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I'd like to thank the High Representative, Ms. Nakamitsu, for her edifying briefing. And we listen closely to Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Bose, and Mr. Radchenko. President, after 16 months of war, Ukraine remains plunged into an unprecedented spiral of violence. The war is begetting terrible human suffering and a humanitarian situation with devastating consequences. Added to this, we have seen food and energy crises, which further make prospects for peace even more remote. The latest report of the UN High Commissioner details 24,862 civilian victims, 1,000 attacks on health infrastructure, and 260 cultural sites damaged, according to UNESCO. Announced offensives and counter-offensives on both sides point to the true toll in terms of the loss of human lives and mass displacements being even higher. President, the repeated attacks by the warring parties on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant leave open the risk of a nuclear catastrophe, and we're still waiting to see the consequences of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, which is a source of environmental, human, and economic insecurity. My country condemns the use of all sorts of weapons with indiscriminate effects targeting populations and civilian infrastructure, including remote-controlled weapons, inflicting needless suffering on people and contributing to fueling the climate of terror. My country reiterates its support to the Director General of the IAEA, and we invite the parties to respect the 5 principles guaranteeing nuclear safety and security. We stand opposed to all politicization and normalization of the nuclear issue. Nuclear power plants are civilian infrastructure protected under international humanitarian law. Diplomacy must prevail over strength and weapons proliferation, which only serves to worsen the conflict. President, my country calls on the warring parties to permit safe, unhindered access for humanitarian aid to all areas where there is a need. In conclusion, we reiterate our call for de-escalation and the launch of good faith negotiations to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing and all the contributions made by the other briefers. Today's meeting was requested by the Russian Federation to condemn the increasing supply of weapons to Ukraine. This is the 6th time the Council is convening on this issue in an attempt to deviate the focus from the appalling acts and violations of international humanitarian law Russian forces are perpetrating in Ukraine. As observed by other Council members, these meetings serve one purpose only: for Russia to cynically try to justify its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. Despite these distractions, we must not lose sight of the reality on the ground. The reality is that on 24th February 2022, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of this Council that is entrusted with safeguarding international peace and security, decided to invade its neighbors. It was Russia's decision to illegally exert the use of force and the devastation that has come with it. The end of this war depends upon Russia and what it decides to do next. So do the prospects for peace. In the meantime, Ukraine has a legitimate right to defend itself from the aggressor, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Malta's position remains unchanged. Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders must be fully safeguarded. The grave humanitarian crisis generated by this full-scale invasion of Ukraine should remain in focus. Nearly 1/3 of Ukraine's entire population has been displaced. 5.9 million have been internally displaced, and more than 8 million, mostly women, have been forced to flee, which has increased their risk of sexual and gender-based violence, whilst facing perilous health conditions. Equally, we are alarmed by the high number of grave human rights violations, which include killings and maiming, abductions, rape, and other forms of sexual violence against children, as well as attacks on schools and hospitals perpetrated by Russian armed forces. We are also alarmed by the systematic mistreatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian hostages by Russia in the temporarily and illegally occupied territories of Ukraine and in Russia, and demand the immediate release of all individuals unlawfully deprived of their liberty. We call on all parties to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. The result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is not only impacting nearly 18 million people in Ukraine, but is having ripple effects all over the world. President, in closing, Malta stresses once again the overwhelming necessity for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine as a matter of utmost priority. The Security Council has the duty to distinguish between the victim and the aggressor and recognize Ukraine's right to self-defense. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be fully upheld. We urge the Russian Federation to halt hostilities, withdraw its military forces and proxies from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized border, and embrace constructive dialogue and diplomacy as the means to establish lasting peace, stability, and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. Mozambique wishes to thank Under Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Madam Nakamisho, and all others who made their insightful briefings today. Madam President, the war in Ukraine, with its deteriorating humanitarian consequences, has been increasing in intensity. This happens despite efforts of the international community at large to bring to an end the conflict that has claimed thousands of human lives and enormous destructions of economic and social infrastructures. This conflict is of our common concern. It poses serious threat to international peace and security. Madam President, it is our considered view that the continuations of the armed conflict and violent confrontations in Ukraine is not the answer to the interests of parties and those of all the world community. In this connection, we call on the parties to the conflict to take responsibility for protecting civilians and ensure compliance with applicable international law and international humanitarian law. Mozambique wishes to reiterate its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the return to direct negotiations between the parties as a matter of urgency and in full respect of United Nations Charter and the relevant Security Council decisions. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
I thank U.S. Nakamitsu and the briefers for their briefing. Madam President, Russia requested this meeting to discuss the issue of increasing supplies of weapons to Ukraine and the implications on diplomatic efforts to resolve the Ukraine crisis. It seems to focus on supporters of Ukraine in the current tragic situation, but we must not lose sight of the root cause. Japan has to repeat its basic position. It is Russia that initiated the unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We therefore underscore Ukraine's right of self-defense against aggression. the arms are provided to Ukraine in order to defend itself. The international community is lending its support to Ukraine in order to stop Russia's aggression for maintaining international peace and security. By contrast, no nation should support Russia's aggression. Japan has expressed its position on the transfer of UAVs from Iran to Russia. Moreover, we are concerned by reports of arms transactions between Russia and North Korea. Any transaction of arms with North Korea is a violation of relevant Security Council resolutions and should be condemned. Japan is closely monitoring related developments. Madam President, any efforts for diplomatic resolution to end this war should have its base on justice. We all know the indisputable facts that, as stated by the overwhelming majority of the UN General Assembly, Russia's aggression is a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Japan is not convinced by the argument that the efforts to support self-defense deter diplomatic efforts to end aggression. Let me pose a question. If a neighboring country launched a war of aggression against your homeland, occupied your territory, and then argued diplomatic efforts to end aggression, what would be the response? For most of the sovereign states, such an argument is unacceptable. Instead of linking support to Ukraine and various diplomatic efforts, Russia must withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from Ukraine and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. And I thank you, Gina Kamitsu, for the briefing and Dr. Radchenko for his insights. We express our disappointment on the wasted time of having two persons with exactly identical positions pretendedly to lead the Council, misleading it with militant views. Sugarcoating an aggression with native English speakers will never make the aggression more digestible. It will not succeed to enforce a narrative that was false from the very start, that remains insincere and has now been totally discredited, even by those who are partners in crime. Last Friday, Prigozhin, he needs no introduction, described the invasion of Ukraine, and I quote, "a racket carried out by a corrupt elite." Colleagues, it has been said many times, and we cannot but reiterate it. When a sovereign country, an independent nation, is attacked without a shred of justification, when people are killed in their homes, hospitals, schools, and kindergarten, including at a restaurant in town, only to satisfy an insatiable imperial appetite, when a UN member is being destroyed, causing mayhem to the country, the region, the continent, and the world, condemnation is not good enough. Recalling the principles of the Charter is good, but not good enough. Calling for the war to stop while droves of missiles and illegally acquired drones destroy civilian infrastructure is good, but not good enough. There is need for more. There was and still is an urgent need to help Ukrainians who are courageously defending their freedom and their right to be themselves, to defend their land, homes, and families, to make sure that the UN Charter is not reduced to mere paper, but has a meaning and a purpose. This is exactly what many countries have been doing and will continue to do. I challenge our colleagues of the Russian Federation to point out to a single article in the UN Charter, to a single line in any UN resolution or any piece of international law that would justify their aggression. And they will not, simply because it doesn't exist. Instead, I can direct them to Article 51 of the UN Charter, which provides a very clear legal basis for individual states to offer whatever assistance to a country exercising its inherent right to self-defense in securing its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And this is a big difference, because there is one aggression and a victim, which makes both sidism for ending the war meaningless and absurd. It is crucial to recognize that one side initiated the conflict and therefore it bears the responsibility to put an end to it. This side can be easily identified. It has consistently been condemned from 143 members of the United Nations General Assembly. There is yet another big difference. The arms transfer to Ukraine has been conducted in accordance with national legislation of the countries concerned, the Arms Trade Treaty, the obligations arising from these acts, and the assessment of risk of diversion. USG Nakamitsu just confirmed that these transfers are open data. An ad hoc commission established by the Ukrainian parliament is responsible for monitoring the entire process so that weapons are used for defense purposes and do not fall in the wrong hands. Meanwhile, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, is using weapons illegally acquired from DPRK and Iran, violating openly and blatantly what they have been entrusted to uphold, the UN Security Council resolutions they themselves have adopted. Colleagues, a knife is a knife. It depends on what it's used for. Therefore, there are weapons to defend life, and there are weapons to kill innocent civilians, including children having dinner at a pizzeria in Kramatorsk. Therefore, Russia will not succeed to shift the responsibility of the war to others, to Ukraine as it pretends, or to other countries as it propagates. Let's not forget that everything we are talking about, including arms supply for Ukraine, is not the cause. It's just the consequence of the Russian aggression. Madam President, we have continuously raised concerns about the consequences of this war for Ukraine, for Europe, and for Russia itself. Last week, I said that the war is changing many things, including Russia, and unfortunately not for the better. The dramatic events of last weekend only reinforced our concerns. They revealed, among others, that the war of choice of Russia is not a one-way path. Actions always have consequences. And whatever the reasons, the dynamics, and their finality, internal developments in Russia send tremors beyond its borders. Because what was intended to be the Swiss knife of Russian military was morphed into a Frankenstein's monster that turned against its very creator. Those hours of total chaos in Russia have revealed many things. The world press and media are full of various analyses. But there is something worth pointing out, something that we knew and was denied. The Wagner Group, the stamp of cruelty in Ukraine and in many parts in Africa, is simply a Russian tool, 100% financed by the government, as per the words of the President Putin himself. The emperor has no clothes. Therefore, the games of who could be deadlier and bloodier in Ukraine was a false competition. It was an inner struggle for money and power at the expense of poor soldiers and innocent civilians. Let me conclude, Madam President, with a last remark. The recent developments in Russia offer another insight worth mentioning. Faced with the prospect of bloodshed in power rivalry, everybody rushed to make a deal, including by pivoting 180 degrees and renouncing their own words. The main reason for such deals was not to spill Russian blood. It is very puzzling that this reasoning does not apply to those they call their brothers, the Ukrainians. This is why the political, humanitarian, and military support for Ukraine must continue and will continue. Because despite of what we hear from Russia and their backed briefers, Ukraine is right and Russia is wrong. The first shoe has been dropped. Freedom will win because it always does, and aggression will lose. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing today. Her continued leadership to counter weapons diversion has been indispensable. As we have repeatedly stated in this Council, it is categorically false for Russia to allege that the international support for Ukraine's legitimate self-defense, support provided by over 50 countries, somehow constitutes a threat to international peace and security. This is a transparent and clumsy attempt by Russia to rewrite the very plain facts of this conflict. Let's be clear. It is Russia's full-scale war of aggression, its invasion of a sovereign neighbor in violation of the UN Charter, that poses the threat to international peace and security. And it is from Russia's full-scale war of aggression that Ukraine is defending itself. Russia's familiar effort to try to divert our attention through false, ever-changing allegations and disinformation is painfully obvious. Just consider, as one example, the issue of Russia's support for the Wagner Group. For years now, this Council has heard the Russian representative repeatedly deny any connection between the Russian state and the Wagner Group. On Tuesday, the Russian delegate insisted to the press outside of this chamber that the Wagner Group is just a private military company and, I quote, detached from the government, unquote. But this week, President Putin finally, nakedly, admitted that the Russian government fully finances the Wagner Group, providing almost $2 billion from state coffers in the past year alone. Putin said, and I quote, "I want to point out, and I want everyone to know about it, the maintenance of the entire Wagner Group was fully provided for by the state. From the Ministry of Defense, from the state budget, we fully financed this group," unquote. Russia has demonstrated time and time again its willingness to abuse its position on the Security Council to purposefully promote falsehoods and disinformation. We regret that Russia continues to deliberately misguide the international community, including through this meeting today. Just remember that in the lead-up to its further invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, Russia's leadership denied it had any plans to send troops into Ukraine, even while it amassed forces on Ukraine's borders. It is Russia's ongoing brutality against Ukraine's people and its campaign to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure that has rallied the international community to Ukraine's aid, both in support of its sovereignty and territorial integrity and in respect for international law. It is Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and its planned stationing of tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, which is complicit in Russia's aggression against Ukraine, that risk further aggravating an already dangerous situation. The overwhelming majority of UN member states have repeatedly made these positions clear. The United States and more than 50 member states have answered Ukraine's call to support its self-defense against Russia's aggression, and we will continue to do so for as long as it takes. These weapons are not prolonging the conflict. The Kremlin bears that responsibility alone. These arms are preventing further brutalization of Ukraine's citizens amidst the Kremlin's onslaught. Please don't forget this point. Russia's unrelenting and ruthless attacks on Ukraine and its people, and the all too familiar stream of false allegations to which Russia subjects us, are just further demonstrations that President Putin has no interest in meaningful diplomacy. Just 2 weeks ago, leaders from several African nations, members of a peace mission bound for Kyiv and Moscow, were forced to shelter in bunkers during their visit to Kyiv as Putin rained missiles on Kyiv. What clearer indication could we be given of the Kremlin's utter disrespect or disinterest in peace or a diplomatic resolution to Putin's war of choice? No one wants this war to end more than Ukraine and its people. But as overwhelmingly articulated by members of the UN General Assembly, the conditions for a just and lasting peace must be rooted in international law. This includes Russia demonstrating a meaningful interest in ending this war and upholding the principles of the UN Charter through action and not just empty words. It is Russia, in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231, that has procured hundreds of drones from Iran and then deployed them in attacks, killing civilians in Ukraine. If Russia had any genuine desire for a de-escalation, it would simply withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory and end its invasion. Instead, we see increased hostilities and brutality, waves of missiles wreaking havoc across Ukraine, and dangerous nuclear rhetoric. We are committed to ensuring Ukraine has the ability to exercise its right to self-defense against Russia's illegal and brutal war, while working with Ukraine to maintain the highest safeguards to ensure the weapons its partners provide are not diverted into unintended hands. We will continue to stress accountability, as we have from the beginning of this conflict, and continue to ensure robust processes to counter attempts at illicit diversion. Throughout this conflict, Ukraine has been a transparent and willing partner in these efforts. By helping Ukraine and neighboring states account for and safeguard arms and ammunition during transfer, in storage, and when deployed, strengthening border management and security in Ukraine and neighboring states, and building the capacity of relevant government agencies to deter, detect, and interdict illicit trafficking of certain weapons, we are taking concrete steps to address threats posed by the potential diversion of weapons. As we have said on many occasions since the beginning of this crisis, if Russia is serious about bringing an end to this conflict, it can simply withdraw its troops from Ukraine and end its war, illegal war of aggression. We once again call on Russia to do so, and to do so now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, I express my thanks for the informative briefing provided by the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. I also listened carefully to the briefings by the other speakers. I recognize the presence in this room of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine. This isn't the first time that this Council has considered the issue of arms supply challenges in the context of Russia's military aggression on Ukraine. I will therefore reiterate what I have been stating consistently in this Council throughout this first half of 2023. First, I must insist on Ecuador's position of rejecting armed violence, militarization, and the building up of weapons. This position is further bolstered by our recognition of the right of peoples to self-defense, in accordance with international law and the United Nations Charter, including Article 51 thereof. Second, the supply of defense materials and systems, including anti-aircraft, contributes to reducing the destruction of infrastructure and the number of civilian casualties when used appropriately. Any supply of weapons or ammunition must be subject to the guarantees of respect for the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution at the time of their use, and must not be made without compliance with and improving on standards of marking, registration, and traceability, prioritizing the protection of civilians and the objective of global stability over any other industrial production or distribution-related interests. Further, the supply of weapons must pursue the purpose of achieving security and protection, and must not be done with the mere aim of testing new offensive equipment on the battlefield. We urge those states that have condemned the invasion and who are involved in supplying weapons to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity, to further enhance their checks to prevent spare parts and other parts and components, including electronic components, from their own manufacturers from feeding the war efforts of the occupying army, particularly in the manufacture of artillery, missiles, and other weaponry. We also reject any transfer of materials that contravene Security Council provisions such as Resolution 2231. All such measures can help prevent diversion and the spread and escalation of conflict, and they are key to post-conflict recovery. In this very chamber, I have repeatedly reiterated our continuing concern at the challenges to peace, security, and stability posed by the large-scale flow of arms and ammunition into any situation of armed conflict. I have also stressed the seriousness of placing weapons in the hands of mercenaries and groups operating on the margins of international law. A few days ago, we saw the so-called private army of the Wagner Group jeopardizing even Russia's own stability. We call on Russia once again to stop definitively the already protracted invasion of Ukraine, which continues to wreak too much destruction and to claim too many lives, and to comply with the decisions of the International Court of Justice. And finally, we advocate the peaceful settlement of disputes, and we reiterate the duty of member states to settle their international disputes by peaceful means pursuant to the Charter. This is the first provision violated by a country that attacks, invades, or attempts to annex territories of another country by force. We must move from the logic of domination of one state over another to the logic of diplomacy. That was the logic of the colonies of the 19th and 18th century. We must replace this with the logic of diplomacy, as laid out in General Assembly Resolution ES 11/6 on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. We recognize and encourage intensified diplomatic efforts to restore dialogue, to move towards this so longed-for peace, and to avoid plunging the world into a wider war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I thank USG and High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu and other briefers for their briefings. Since the outbreak of the Ukraine crisis, there have been incessant, massive flows of weapons and equipment into the battlefield with steadily increased variety and quantity and greater lethality and destructive power. As a result, the spillover effects and proliferation risks are on the rise. At the same time, this crisis since day one has led to mounting civilian casualties and devastation of civilian facilities in conflict areas. Black Swan and Grey Rhino incidents have occurred thick and fast. The situation on the ground has become increasingly brutal, dire, dangerous, and unpredictable. We find these deeply concerning. As things stand now, what the world needs is a ceasefire and cessation of fighting, not pumping weapons into the battlefield. The world needs dialogue and negotiation, not escalated fighting. The world needs peace talks, not camp-to-camp confrontation. In recent months and weeks, we've seen a growing number of countries putting forward peace proposals. The voice for peace talks has been growing. We hope that the parties concerned will respond positively to the international community's call of reason, stay calm, exercise restraint, avoid escalating tensions, and engage more closely to forge consensus with a view to accumulating and creating conditions for the final settlement of the crisis. On the issue of Ukraine, China's consistent position is as follows: upholding the sovereignty and territorial integrity, abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and respecting the legitimate security concerns of all parties. All efforts, as long as they are conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis, deserve our support. China has all along stayed engaged with all the parties concerned over the Ukraine crisis, actively encouraging and facilitating peace talks. We stand ready to work with peace-loving and justice-upholding countries around the world to keep up our positive and constructive contribution to the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, of the Ukraine issue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I thank Under-Secretary General Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing, and I welcome Ukraine's participation in today's meeting. As we have stated repeatedly in this chamber, it is vital to safeguard weapons during transfer, storage and deployment, And in particular, we wish to echo the High Representative's call for vigilance against the risks of diversion. We continue to urge concerted steps by all parties with responsibility and transparency to mitigate the risks associated with arms transfers in this context. And we call on the Security Council to ensure uniform compliance with all its relevant resolutions. For 16 months, this war has devastated Ukraine. It has killed thousands, displaced millions, and inflicted billions of dollars of damage to critical infrastructure. A generation of families is forever changed. Children growing up with the trauma of living under constant bombardment, fathers that are on the front lines instead of at home, mothers on whose shoulders disproportionately falls the responsibility of providing both sustenance and security. Ukraine's fertile fields, which only recently fed hundreds of millions around the world, are transformed into battlefields, crisscrossed by hundreds of kilometers of front lines, marked by trenches reminiscent of the First World War, and a terrifying display of the capabilities of the most advanced military technologies of this century. While this may be a European war in geography, it is most certainly a global concern. Outside the theater of war, Europe is again threatened by the dynamics that once divided it into two rival camps. Political, economic, social, and cultural links, optimistic bonds of community that once brought the continent together at a time of great promise, are being progressively and almost irreparably unwound. A decoupling will have profound implications for the future of Europe and around the world. The war's impact on the global economy, on trade and commodities, energy and food has been discussed extensively in this and other fora. Today, we contend with the once unthinkable but now tangible prospect of a nuclear disaster. Countries around the world are impacted every day by this war and its consequences, with no diplomatic reprieve on the horizon. At the same time, the world must contend with an impaired post-pandemic economic recovery and debt crisis. The multilateral system is weighed down with division and polarization at precisely the moment it needs to rise up and meet the existential challenge of climate change and create a blueprint for the sustainable development agenda and economic growth. A constant call echoes from every corner of the globe in support of a peaceful resolution to this conflict. Member states have kept faith with the UN Charter, and therein lies our hope and the blueprint for what happens next. In large majorities, countries have repeatedly voted for an end to this war that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. It is time for a serious effort to that end. We cannot afford repeat cycles of approaching the precipice of disaster only to walk back at the very last moment. Too much is at stake. To that end, the UAE strongly urges a cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine and the vigorous pursuit of a just and lasting peace. Only by abiding with the UN Charter will the end of this conflict enshrine an inclusive and stable security architecture for Europe. Only by abiding with the UN Charter will the end of this conflict preserve sovereignty as the foundational building block of our open and cooperative international order for the benefit of all of us. We are under no illusions of the difficulty of the diplomacy required to end this war, but the countries with the most ability to influence the future course of events are seated around this table. We are in no need of further reminders of the consequences of the alternative. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, President. I'd like to make a few comments in response to some of the hypotheses. Kramatorsk, which was allegedly shelled. Here's a statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense. As a result of an attack on the 27th of June in Kramatorsk in the Donetsk People's Republic, where there was a temporary deployment, the 56th Motorized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, which, and this I'm adding, included a hotel which was located there, destroyed 2 generals, up to 50 officers from the Ukrainian armed forces. They were destroyed, as well as up to 20 military advisors and mercenaries, foreign mercenaries. No need to comment on that. Turning now to comments on Wagner. Today, a number of delegations attempted to refer to events which occurred in the Russian Federation last week. These are our domestic affairs. Nevertheless, I will say that the leadership of the Russian Federation adopted exhaustive measures to address the situation. We did this as swiftly as possible, avoiding any large-scale destabilization in the country, as well as any bloodshed amongst the civilian population. Legal actions by the mutineers resulted in a strong reaction from society. The government responded, as did the president. All of this showed that the enemies of Russia cannot use the situation to their advantage. We'd like to note that many friendly nations responded to the events and expressed their support and concern for us. In your assessments, in some of your assessments rather, your assessments were brimming with regret. Regret about the fact that events did not take the turn you would have liked them to take. That it didn't result in a mutiny in Russia. And this couldn't have been the result, as we can now see, although you and the regime you back in Kiev were pinning a lot of hope on this, monitoring events with bated breath. And of course, you were severely disappointed. As for the poisonous insinuations of the representative of the UK, they were brimming with lies and traditional British cliches, especially regarding the methods of waging war, the so-called kidnapping of children, the supposed use of these children as human shields, inclusion in the report on children in armed conflict. And there were other allegations leveled at us as well. We will respond to those in due course, and this will be during the British presidency at the Security Council. The representative of the US, once again, has been lying unabashedly about a number of things, including the airstrikes targeting Kiev during the visit of a delegation, a foreign delegation there. Although this was refuted not just by ourselves, but by the African delegations themselves who visited Kiev and who qualified what went down as a sham provocation. I'd like to add that in order to put an end to this war, Kiev's UK sponsors need to give orders to their vassals in Kiev. If there is no such order, if there aren't any such signals, well, they can only mean one thing. The US is not interested, has no desire to put an end to this conflict. It's only interested in the conflict continuing as it waits to be able to inflict defeat on the Russian Federation, which, as the US has described it, should be a strategic defeat. And may I tell you, you won't see the day when that happens. Last but not least, I'd like to once again thank Mr. Blumenthal and Mr. Bose for their very sober, their very informative assessments. The truth you are disseminating is not to the liking of some in the room today. We'd like to apologize for the actions of those colleagues who try to turn your briefings into a profanation. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General Nakamitsu. I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Today he has again described to us what the way out should look like according to Russia. In a nutshell, this is a situation in which Russia has enough weapons to attack Ukraine anytime it so decides, while Ukraine has no weapons to defend itself. In reality, it would mean that bloody attacks like Tuesday's missile strike on Kramatorsk, Donetsk region, could happen on a permanent basis without any hindrance. 12 killed, including 3 children, and 60 wounded. That was the outcome of Russian missile hitting a local restaurant in the city center. And by the way, what can be a more authoritative and reliable source of information than the Russian Ministry of War? The Russian armed forces are not getting tired of proving the validity of the Secretary General's decision to list them and affiliated armed groups in his annual report on children and armed conflict. This is exactly the list which the Russian army belongs on, after all the horrible crimes they have committed and continue to commit daily against children in Ukraine. And it is not because Ukraine receives weapons that these 3 young girls were killed by Russia in Kramatorsk, but because Russia still has weapons and remains willing to kill. I urge those who seem to be concerned about weapon transfers to conflict zones not to forget the difference between the aggressor and the defender who fights to survive. At the same time, I cannot but note that the issue of illicit arms trafficking in and out of Russia appears to be more than pertinent and timely following the weekend's events in Russia. On numerous occasions, including in this chamber, Ukraine has drawn the attention of the UN community to the security threats stemming from the Russian practices of recruiting people with criminal backgrounds for proxy armed formations, of equipping these formations with a whole range of conventional weapons and thus helping them evolve into de facto parallel armies. This was the case with the infamous Wagner Group, known for its crimes in the Middle East, Africa, and Ukraine. While operating there, the Wagner Group used weapons that were not subject to any control mechanisms, including internal Russian ones. For decades, Russia has multiplied crises throughout the world, trying to hide its responsibility behind such proxy structures. Finally, Russian aggression has incrementally started returning to its home harbor. It turned out that Russia, which so generously labeled other nations as failed states, showed failure and the incapability of its own governance starting from the highest level. The whole world witnessed the paralysis of the authorities when armed mercenary units easily crossed the state border of the Russian Federation, and when they took the city of Rostov-on-Don of more than 1 million people without a fight, when they were advancing with little resistance towards the Russian capital and shooting down Russian aircraft and helicopters from modern anti-aircraft missile systems along their way. Saturday's events also highlighted that the safety and security of weapon arsenals on Russian territory are easily compromised by Wagner-like armed formations. There are several lessons that the international community should draw from these events. While proving its inadequacy by continuing the war against Ukraine with no chance of success, Putin's regime also demonstrated it is no longer capable of controlling its own country. Saturday's advance on Moscow was stopped only by the decision of the Wagner chief following the engagement of Belarusian dictator Lukashenko. Putin's regime has been built on lies and hypocrisy. For years, Putin lied that the Wagner Group had no affiliation with the Russian government. Putin's quotation from his press conference with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in January 2020 about the presence of the Wagner Group in Libya. Let me quote. If there are Russian citizens there, they do not represent the interests of the Russian state and do not receive money from the Russian government. End of quote. Another quotation from Putin's press conference with French President Macron in February 2022 about the activities of the Wagner Group in Mali. I quote, regarding Wagner, as I have already said, the Russian government has nothing to do with it. End of quote. And this week, Putin confessed that the group was fully funded by the state and has received 86.3 billion Russian rubles, which is equivalent to $1 billion from the state budget between May 2022 and May 2023. 1/3 of Russian regions have annually budgets smaller than this amount. Additionally, the Russian government allocated 110 billion rubles, that is approximately $1.29 billion, for insurance payments for Wagner Group fighters. These expenditures do not include the equipment and weapons the Wagner Group were generously given all these years. It was not only the habit of lying to everyone everywhere that Putin's confession revealed. The case of the Wagner Group, which has been a product of the Kremlin from the very beginning, also showed that Putin and his cronies are not reliable or predictable even one step ahead. This regime continues to pose an existential threat not only for its neighbors and other regions throughout the world, but also for Russia itself. Madam President, Putin's regime will only keep degenerating while generating new crises and threats until it finally collapses. The international community should therefore address the Russia crisis as one of priority tasks. I reiterate that the military defeat of Russia in Ukraine, ensuring accountability for the crimes committed, and international control over the Russian military arsenal should be the necessary elements of the resolution of the Russian crisis. Ukraine continues to do its best in order to survive and to stop the evil. We are grateful to all responsible nations that support us, including by supplying necessary weapons. Their use has been an element of Ukraine exercising the inherent right to self-defense under the above-mentioned Article 51 of the UN Charter for a noble goal to restore respect to the UN Charter. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we call on the Security Council to keep its eye on the Russian crisis and to take the necessary steps to address many imminent threats and challenges that this failing state poses to the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.